you actually can program jazz drums. Hi, I'm Samuel Prather, founder of Go Music, Reason user since 2003. Despite what jazz drummers like myself might want you to think, it actually is not impossible to program convincing jazz drums as long as you know what the rules are. What I'm going to talk about today is building on a video that I made previously. If you haven't checked out how to program realistic sounding drums with Reason drum kits, please check out that video. You probably won't understand this video if you haven't checked that one out. The main rules that I want to go over today, obviously this isn't everything that you need to know to be a jazz drummer. This is something that takes years, even decades to master in the physical form. But there are some basic principles that you can add to your programming that will at least not give away that you don't play jazz drums. And I like to think about these as being more guidelines than rules, but the first one is that jazz is based on the eighth note triplet, generally speaking. So if we're counting in 4/4, 1, 2, 3, 4, jazz is based on 1 pull-lit, 2 pull-lit, 3 pull-lit, 4 pull-lit. It's that undercurrent that's underneath of it that makes it feel the way that it does. The other guideline that I'm going for when I program jazz drums is to make sure that I include 3/2 or 4/3 in some way. It is an African derived style of music, and African music is not just in 4/4, it's not just in 12/8. Oftentimes it pulls from 1, 2, or even several different time signatures at the same time. The third guideline, and once again because it's an African derived music, there is an element that is very common in African music, which is call and response. So I want to make sure that my basic groove is made up of eighth note triplets. I also want to make sure I'm using that 3/2 and different time signature influence thing that happens in jazz and African music in general. And then lastly, I want to make sure that it sounds like there's call and response, that there's breathing and communication between the other players. I definitely want to reinforce that if you don't listen to the music, it's going to be very difficult to do this. You need to spend the time listening to the record so that you know what this is supposed to sound like. Otherwise, you're just stabbing in the dark. So I encourage you to go check out whatever genre of music that you're producing. In particular, if you're trying to program jazz drums to sound real, you need to listen and study jazz music. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and go to the computer and open up a file that I made for you guys already. I took the horn solo from a song on my most recent record, Just Joshing You, and I just took the bass and the saxophone so that I can show you how I might start programming a jazz drum accompaniment based on that. All right, as you can see, bass here, tenor sax on this track. This is what it sounds like. So the first thing that you notice is that it doesn't really line up with the click very well. So I want to fix that first because I don't want to quantize the events on the track, but I do want to make sure that the drummer, the bass player, and the saxophone player are all agreeing on the same one. So when I look here, I see the quarter note that the bass player is playing, and it's hitting behind. This is probably my fault because during the recording process, I had a really cheap MIDI interface with bad latency, but either way, I want to fix this. What I'm going to do, I took the snap off and I'm just going to grab both of these because they were recorded at the same time and are pretty much the same amount behind. They work well together, just not with the click. So I'm going to take a little bit off the front that looks like about that distance, and I'm going to drag it so that now... All right, so now everybody's playing right on the beat. As with most genres of music, I'm going to start with the pocket, but because it's jazz and it requires more variation, I'm going to have about 5 or 6 different layers that I'm going to go ahead and program. I used a redrum, and the first loop, enabling my pattern selection. So what I did was just put the bass drum on quarter notes, the ride cymbal on quarter notes, and then I had the hi-hat cymbal on 2 and 4. I know it doesn't sound like that yet, but that's what it's going to be when I move it to the right place. This is what the second loop sounds like. This is what the third loop sounds like. This is the fourth one. Alright, that one's special because it's actually in 3. It's like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. That goes back to that 3/2 thing I mentioned earlier. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Alright, and so I just took a very common jazz phrase for that last loop. Dot, da da doom, boom. 8th note triplets going into the downbeat in a crash. And last but not least, I have a pocket that incorporates the traditional swing beat that most people are used to hearing as opposed to just quarter notes on the ride. I don't want to use this one too much because it can be one of the things that's a dead giveaway that it's not a real drummer. A lot of times when a real drummer is playing straight ahead jazz, they're going to switch that pattern back and forth between a quarter and that traditional pattern that you just heard. So the next thing I'm going to do is open up an instance of my Reason Drum Kits rack extension. And I'm going to go one by one and take each of those patterns and copy them to the track. Like so. That's my first loop. I'm going to put it here. I'm going to make a dub. Then I'm going to do the second track. I'm going to go ahead and move this up here because it's more like a fill than the groove. And put that last one in its place, so that I know that the basic pocket is at the bottom and the variation is at the top. Now that we've copied all that MIDI information into our Reason drum kits lanes, now we need to make sure the notes are in the right place so that they sound how we want them to. Because the redrum only goes from 1 to 10, 1 being C1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? So all that information only spans less than an octave, but Reason Drum Kits has over 4 octaves of sounds that you can use. So you have to move the notes to the right note so that they'll sound the way that you want them to. I'm going to move my closed hi-hat sound up to C4. I'm going to move my ride cymbal up to D sharp 2. And I'm going to leave the kick drum where it is on C1. That's fine. Now let's hear what the pocket sounds like with the bass and the saxophone. Not bad. Okay, this one I want to be a crash. But not this one because that's not really a typically jazz crash. Maybe. There we go. Now that might sound like just a gong by itself, but when you pair that with the kick drum, it's going to sound more authentic. Because there was so much space in between the programming, when I copied the pattern to track, it left gaps in this lane. I'm going to close that up by just saying join clips. That way now I can do all of it at once. Okay, now that we've put everything in the right lane and we know what it sounds like, this process took me about 10 minutes. Now I'm going to go back to my basic pocket and change the mixer level so that it sounds more like jazz. Traditionally speaking, jazz doesn't have a big boomy kick drum that's in front of everything. In fact, it's usually behind it until certain points where it's supposed to be louder. My teacher used to always tell me it needs to be felt, not heard. So what I'm going to do is pull down the kick drum a little bit, and I'm going to pull up the overhead and the hi-hat, both of which you tend to hear more of in jazz. it's not bad, but it's still really wooden. I'm going to open up the tool window and I'm going to randomize all this information by 20% just flat across the board. This is definitely not a bad start. Now if you tune into the second half of this video, I'm going to show you how to build organic variation just by combining these 7 different layers that we've put into our Reason drum kits. See you on part 2.